Monday evening will be the Feast of Purim. It's a Jewish feast that comes from the book of Esther. And the book of Esther, many lessons are to be found there. People will draw lessons on prayer and fasting and the importance of doing what God calls you to do because you've been born for such a time as this. But unless we pick up on one major theme in the book of Esther, we're going to completely misuse Esther. And the issue here is the issue of anti-Semitism, Jew hatred. That all of these things that we see in Esther surrounds God's purposes for Israel as a nation. And it's about those who oppose Israel and desire Israel's destruction. And what will happen to such people? At the moment in South Africa, we're in the middle of what people are calling the Esther fast. From Friday night all the way to Monday evening. People all over South Africa are fasting because they want to see a change of government. And they've read the book of Esther and they saw how she fasted 3 days and 3 nights. And therefore, at the end, they believe that resulted in a change of government. At the moment in South Africa, corruption is rife. We just had an interview put out by a news channel, national news channel, where they interviewed De Ruyter, who was the then outgoing CEO of Eskom. It happened very recently. And he spilled the beans on corrupt dealings within the organ and how that relates to people even high up in the government. And so there's a big discussion happening at the moment. And so people are thinking, well, Esther called all God's people to fast, and that resulted in a shift in government. And so therefore, we to do the same thing. They're missing some central aspects of what the fast of Esther was about. Firstly, it wasn't about corruption. It was about the preservation of the Jewish people whom Haman was trying to annihilate. Esther actually says to the king, if you'd only enslaved us, I would not have felt compelled to come and speak to you. The fasting was there because it was the legalized annihilation, genocide, complete genocide, not of some of the Jews, not of most of the Jews, but of all of the Jews. Secondly, it didn't result in any shift in government. The only shift there was Haman was taken out of the way, but the government still retained its own modus operandi. It didn't really change. All that happened is the Jewish people were saved. And when we forget this issue of the preservation of the Jewish people and the nasty results of anti-Semitism that will surface if the root of anti-Semitism is not taken out, we'll miss what Esther is about. We'll misuse Esther. That is central. So let's look at this issue. It plagues us even today. There's a book by, I've got it here. There's a guy called Edward Flannery. Now, he was a Catholic, Catholic clergyman. But this book is not a theology book. It's a history book. And it's called The Anguish of the Jews. And its subtitle is 23 Centuries of Anti-Semitism, going all the way back to the Egyptians, running all the way through the Catholic Church and in the Protestant churches as well. This is a book worth reading just from a historical point of view. On March the 5th, 2012, it was a Monday, Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel met with the then President Barack Obama of America. And there was a negotiation happening with Iran. They call it the nuclear deal. You'll remember it, that America was very much at that point pro-Iran developing its nuclear energy, but everybody's concerned that they're going to build nuclear weapons, which was true. Iran had an anti-America, anti-Israel rhetoric. They still have to this day. And they want to see Israel destroyed. They've been supplying arms to proxies such as Hezbollah. to fight against Israel. And so Netanyahu met with Obama and gave him a Purim present. And the Purim present was a Megillat Esther, a scroll of Esther. And it was a warning to Obama, be careful how you deal with the Jew, because anyone who tries to annihilate the Jew will be destroyed. Purim 2012. This is the lesson of Esther. Be careful how you deal with the Jewish people. For when you try to destroy them, you too will be destroyed. But Israel will survive. When we look at what happened in these events in the book of Esther, the main players in this whole historical discourse, firstly, is Mordecai. Mordecai is from the tribe of Benjamin. He's a descendant of Kish, and he's a descendant of Kish's descendant, or son or grandson, Shimei. Shimei, you'll remember him, he's the one in 2 Samuel chapter 15 who was throwing stones at King David as he was running away from Absalom, and shouting and cursing him and saying, "You man of bloodshed, you worthless fellow, God is repaying you for the bloodshed of the house of Saul." That's the same Shimei that Mordecai is descended from. Then you've got Esther, who is his cousin, the daughter of Mordecai's uncle. But Esther's parents have died. They were all part of the Babylonian captivity. And through Babylon, the city of Jerusalem fell. Most of the nation of the kingdom of Judah was taken into exile. But after Nebuchadnezzar's grandson, Belshazzar, the kingdom of Babylon fell to the Persians and the Medes. And so Cyrus, he gave a permission for the Jewish people, a decree that allowed the Jewish people to go back to the land of Jerusalem, whoever wanted to go. And it was at this time, during this empire of the Persians, that Mordecai and Esther find themselves there. Now, Esther's actual name is Hadassah, which is a Hebrew word meaning myrtle. But Esther is her Babylonian name. It's the same name as Ishtar. It means star. And Ishtar is associated with the planet Venus, the bright and morning star. And she was seen as the goddess of war and of love. And so here she is with this pagan name. And we know what happens there, that the king throws this huge party. You can drink as much as you want, but no one's to be forced to do that, because the Persians were pretty liberal. Now, Xerxes, or Ahasuerus, or Achashverosh, as it is in Hebrew, Ahasuerus is his transliteration of his name, but we call him in history King Xerxes. And Xerxes was pretty much a self-lover. He loved himself, he loved luxury, and he was pretty tyrannical. You didn't mess about with him. But by and large, Persia was a pretty liberal society. You can worship any god you want. You can do anything you like. But while they're drinking and they've got all the guests there, he calls for Queen Vashti, one of his queens, to come forward to basically parade her beauty, and she refuses, and so they banish her. And now the king feels that somebody needs to be put in Vashti's place, so he calls a huge beauty pageant, and they call all the single beautiful girls of the kingdom to come to the palace, and he's going to choose one of them. Now this harem basically will have these girls who don't get picked subjected to perpetual widowhood. Like they're never gonna have families, and they're never gonna have children. So it's pretty misogynistic setup, and there was a very much a concern amongst the elite of that society, the king's court, that they didn't want to spark anything of a feminist movement in their kingdom. They wanted to put women in their place. And caught in all of this is Esther. Esther's basically brought there. She is Mordecai's cousin. Her parents have died at some point. And so he is her guardian. He's his own cousin's guardian. He's like a father figure to her. And so she, out of all the women that get in the court, she's the one that gets picked. Now, there's a third player in this whole historical series of events, and that's Haman. We read about him in Esther chapter 3 verse 1. After these events, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him and established his authority over all the princes who were with him. He's an Agagite. Now what does that refer to? If we go back to 1 Samuel chapter 15 and verse 1, it says, Then Samuel said to Saul, now Saul is the son of Kish, who's the ancestor of Mordecai. Saul is from the same family, all those years ago. And Samuel said to Saul, The Lord sent me to anoint you as king over his people, over Israel. Now therefore listen to the words of the Lord. Thus says the Lord of hosts, I will punish Amalek for what he did to Israel, how he set himself against him on the way while he was coming up from Egypt. And we read about that in Exodus. Let's go to Exodus chapter 17 verses 8 to 16. Exodus chapter 17 verses 8 to 16. And it says this, Then Amalek came and fought against Israel at Rephidim. So Moses said to Joshua, Choose men for us and go out, fight against Amalek. Tomorrow I will station myself on top of the hill with the staff of God in my hand. Joshua did as Moses told him and fought against Amalek. And Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. So it came about when Moses held his hand up that Israel prevailed, and when he let his hand down, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hands were heavy. Then they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it. And Aaron and Hur supported his hands, one on the one side and one on the other. Thus his hands were steady until the sun set. So Joshua overwhelmed Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. Then the Lord said to Moses, Write this in a book as a memorial and recite it to Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. Moses built an altar and named it, The Lord is my banner, Adonai Nissi. And he said, The Lord has sworn, the Lord will have war against Amalek from generation to generation. So right back there at the time of the Exodus, Amalek's anti-Semitism and the desire that they had to destroy the Jewish people, maybe possibly understanding that the God of Israel was on their side to cause them to take over the land. They seek to come against them. And therefore, Amalek is opposed by God himself. And this is still the case in 1 Samuel at the time of Saul. God has a contention with Amalek that is historical. The root of anti-Semitism had not been dug out of the Amalekites. And so God remembers his contention with them. Unless the root of anti-Semitism is rooted out, a nation will in the future experience the hostility of a God, because this pernicious root of anti-Semitism does not lay dormant forever. It will express itself, as we'll see when we look at the issue of the Holocaust. And so God is punishing Amalek at the time of Saul. And he says now in verse 3, Now go and strike at Amalek and utterly destroy all that he has. And do not spare him, but put to death both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. Then Saul summoned the people and numbered them in Telaim, 200,000 foot soldiers and 10,000 men of Judah. Saul came to the city of Amalek and set an ambush in the valley. Saul said to the Kenites, Go down from among the Amalekites, so that I do not destroy you with them. For you showed kindness to all the sons of Israel when they departed up from Egypt. You see, God not only remembers the anti-Semitism, but he also remembers the philo-Semitism, the love for Jewish people. And Saul shows mercy to them, but they must depart from the Amalekites. They must make themselves separate from the Amalekites, or else they will be destroyed with the Amalekites. So the Kenites departed from among the Amalekites. Verse 7, So Saul defeated the Amalekites from Havilah as you go to Shur, which is east of Egypt. he captured Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive. Agag, the ancestor of Haman. He's an Agagite. He's descended from Agag, the Amalekite, who are under judgment from God, whose hostility towards the Jewish people never ends. And look at what he says. But Saul and the people spared Agag, and the best of the sheep, the oxen, the fatlings, the lambs, and all that was good, and were not willing to destroy them utterly. But everything despised and worthless they utterly destroyed. It is Samuel that strikes down Agag. Saul doesn't. Now the descendant of Agag tries to destroy the Jewish people, just as his Amalekite ancestors did. But it's another son of Kish, another descendant of Kish, who this time succeeds in destroying the Agagite. To understand these dealings, you have to go right back to something that's been preached time and time and time again, but needs to be repeated time and time again, so that we always have it at the front of our minds when it comes to issues like this. God says to Abram, "Now the Lord said to Abram, go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house, to the land which I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and make your name great, and so you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you, I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth will be blessed." When you curse God's people, Israel, you yourself will be cursed. And the Amalekites are a supreme example of that. The Amalekites are a supreme example of that. If God wants to judge his people, Israel, he will use the wicked to do it. He never uses the righteous. Because the wicked, they not only volunteer for the task, but they do way more than God even requires. You go to Zechariah chapter 1 verse 15. Zechariah chapter 1 verse 15. God says this, "I am very angry with the nations who are at ease. For while I was only a little angry, they furthered the disaster. Therefore thus says the Lord, I will return to Jerusalem with compassion. My house will be built in it, declares the Lord of hosts, and the measuring line will be stretched over Jerusalem." God himself takes issue with those he uses to chastise his people. Why? Because he only required certain actions from them, but they volunteered for more. Not only did they want to subjugate and to enslave and to cut down Israel, but they were willing to annihilate Israel and go further than God required them to. So God then says, "I will now judge you." This is the outworking of the Abrahamic covenant. Those who curse you, I will curse. This is exactly what Haman experiences in the book of Esther. And you actually see this in the Deuteronomy blessings and curses. Deuteronomy, and the curses of Deuteronomy, they're pretty severe. You read about them in chapter 28. And let's just read these. Verse 25. So, actually, let's go from verse 20. Exodus 28, verse 20. "The Lord will send upon you curses, confusion, and rebuke in all you undertake to do, until you are destroyed and until you perish quickly, on account of the evil of your deeds, because you have forsaken me." So if God's people kept the laws that God gave on that day in the book of Deuteronomy, God would heap blessings on them. He blessed their kneading bowl, bless them in the country, bless them in the city, bless everything. But if they forsook him and turned to idols, then God would forsake them. And it says in verse 21, "The Lord will make the pestilence cling to you until he has consumed you from the land where you are entering to possess it. In other words, he'll drive them out of that land. There will be exile. The Lord will smite you with consumption, and with fever, and with inflammation, and with fiery heat, with the sword, and with blight, and with mildew, and they will pursue you until you perish. The heaven which is over your head shall be bronze, and the earth which is under you iron. In other words, they're not going to experience the fruitfulness of the land. The Lord will make the rain of the land powder and dust from heaven. In other words, there's going to be no rain. It shall come down upon you until you are destroyed. The Lord shall cause you to be defeated before your enemies. The anti-Semites will be victorious. You will go out one way against them, but you will flee 7 ways before them. And you will be an example of terror to all the kingdoms of the earth. They're going to be shocked at what happens to God's people Israel. Your carcasses will be food to all the birds of the sky and to the beasts of the earth, and there will be no one to frighten them away. The Lord will smite you with the boils of Egypt, with the tumors, and with the scab, and with the itch from which you cannot be healed. The Lord will smite you with madness, and with blindness, and with bewilderness of heart. And you will grope at noon, as the blind man gropes in darkness, and you will not prosper in your ways. But you shall only be oppressed and robbed continually, with none to save you. You shall betroth a wife, but another man will violate her. You shall build a house, but you will not live in it. You shall plant a vineyard, but you will not use its fruit. Your ox will be slaughtered before your eyes, but you will not eat of it. Your donkey shall be torn away from you, and will not be restored to you. Your sheep shall be given to your enemies, and you will have none to save you. Your sons and your daughters shall be given to another people, while your eyes look on and yearn for them continually, but there will be nothing you can do. The people whom you do not know shall eat up the produce of your ground and all your labors, and you will never be anything but oppressed and crushed continually. You shall be driven mad by the sight of what you see. The Lord will strike you on the knees and legs with sore boils from which you cannot be healed, from the sole of your foot to the crown of your head, just like Job. The Lord will bring on you and your king, whom you set over you, a nation which neither you nor your fathers have known. And there you shall serve other gods, wood and stone. You shall become a horror, a proverb, and a taunt among all the people where the Lord drives you. You shall bring out much seed to the field, but you will gather in little, for the locust will consume it. You shall plant and cultivate vineyards, but you will neither drink of the wine nor gather the grapes, for the worm will devour them. You shall have olive trees throughout your territory, but you will not anoint yourself with the oil, for your olives will drop off. You shall have sons and daughters, but they will not be yours, for they shall go into captivity. The cricket shall possess all your trees and the produce of your ground. The alien who is among you shall rise above you higher and higher, but you will go down lower and lower. He shall lend to you, but you will not lend to him. He shall be the head, and you will be the tail. So all these curses shall come upon you and pursue you and overtake you until you are destroyed, because you would not obey the Lord your God by keeping his commandments and his statutes which he commanded you. They shall become a sign and a wonder on you and your descendants forever. We could carry on, but this is hectic stuff. And it would seem, if you read this, that God is finished with his people Israel until you get to chapter 30 and verse 1. So it shall be, when all these things have come upon you, the blessing and the curse which I have set before you, and you call them to mind in all the nations where the Lord your God has banished you, and you return to the Lord your God, and obey him with all your heart and soul, according to all that I command you today, you and your sons, then the Lord your God will restore you from captivity, and have compassion on you, and will gather you again from all the peoples where the Lord your God has scattered you. And look at what it says in verse 7. The Lord your God will inflict all these curses on your enemies, and on those who hate you, who persecuted you. The anti-Semites, when Israel's restored, will experience the same judgments that the people of Israel suffered. Except there will be remedy for Israel going through those curses, but there will be no remedy for these peoples. The anti-Semites will be taken out. Now, what do we learn about this? In the book of Esther, this principle, though it's not Israel's restoration to the land, but it's at the time of their restoration to the land. They've been starting to go back. That's when Haman tries to destroy them. And that's when God deals with Haman swiftly. But how does he do that? He uses people. He uses people to defend the people of Israel. He uses a Jewish girl to defend the people of Israel and to stand in the gap. He calls the nation to intercede, but he calls on this one Jewish girl to face the king and to stand for God's people, Israel. We go to Esther chapter 4. Esther chapter 4. And we're going to read verses 15 to 17. Haman basically has gone to the king. He's got the king to put his signet ring and make it law that on a certain day in the year, at the end of the year, all the people in Persia will be able to rise up against the Jew and by law annihilate them. Now we see Haman deciding to do this in chapter 3. So let's go from in chapter 3. And we're going to go from verse 2. All the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman. For so the king had commanded concerning him. But Mordecai neither bowed down nor paid homage. Now some people believe it's because Haman wore something around himself that portrayed himself as a god, and therefore Haman would not bow down before him because it would be an act of worship to him as a god. Other people think maybe it's because he knew who Haman was, that he was a descendant of Agag and therefore would give him no honor at all. Whatever the case, that latent anti-Semitism that was simmering under the surface comes to the fore when Haman sees what Mordecai refuses to do. And so in verse 3 it says, Then the king's servant who at the king's gate said to Mordecai, Why are you transgressing the king's command? Now it was when they'd spoken daily to him and he would not listen to them, that they told Haman to see whether Mordecai's reason would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai neither bowed down nor paid homage to him, Haman was filled with rage. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him who the people of Mordecai were. Therefore Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. That's the first thing about anti-Semitism that you notice. That when a Jew does a bad thing to a non-Jew, if that person's an anti-Semite, they won't have an issue with that Jew. They'll have an issue with Jews, full stop. Now, Mordecai didn't do anything wrong, but Haman felt he was wrong. And the anti-Semitism within him caused him to take what he experienced with Mordecai and apply it to the whole people. This book is called The Roots of Anti-Semitism in South Africa by Shane. What's his name? Milton Shane. And this book shows how anti-Semitism grew in South Africa. And one thing he notes is that when the European Jews came, the Jews that were living in Germany and France, and they had that similar culture, people didn't have that much problem with Jews. But when they started coming from the communist countries, escaping communism, from Lithuania, and their ways were different, and there were some underhanded dealings with some of the shops he documents, a number of people felt that Jews were dishonest. They felt also that communism, this Bolshevik revolution, was a conspiracy by the Jewish people. And huge anti-Semitic antipathy was expressed against the Jewish people, especially from the very strong nationalistic Afrikaner. There was a trial, there's a book called The Lie That Wouldn't Die, and it's basically exposing the protocols of the learned elders of Zion as a forgery based on two works of fiction. One was by a German guy, and I'm trying to remember if his name was Goethe or Goethe, about 12 Jews around the grave of a rabbi. And there was another called, it was by Maurice Joly, and he wrote a satire that concerned Napoleon. And so the ingredients of these two pieces of literature really formulated the basis of the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. It was a Russian forgery. It was a Russian piece of work put together by people within the Russian military, and there was a certain prophetic figure, with a doomsday prophet within Russia, who believed that there would be a Jewish Antichrist and the Jews taking over the world. And he basically popularized these writings, which became, after they were redacted, the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. And this was put out all over the world and translated. In fact, Henry Ford of Ford Motors had it translated into English. And he was taken to court. And he lost the case to prove that this was a genuine document that was written by Jewish people. And as a result, he had to recall all the copies of the protocols off the shelves of all the bookstores. And that happened in the States, but it didn't happen in Germany. And one of the main people in Germany that had a copy of his book was none other than Herr Hitler. And so Adolf Hitler had this book and the writings of Luther about the Jews and their crimes. And he used these to facilitate this, what they called the final solution. And we'll look at that just now. But what we see about this book here is the anti-Semitism that was expressed was latent. People had that in their hearts. There were little attitudes against the Jewish people that when they encountered these Jews from the countries like Lithuania, the eastern countries, then this anti-Semitism came out big time. In fact, in this book, The Lie That Wouldn't Die, by Hadassah Ben Ito, Hadassah, she documents a trial in Grahamstown, where in Port Elizabeth in the synagogue, some people claimed they found a letter talking about how the Jews were taking over all the farmland in South Africa. And they signed it according to the rabbi, but it was Rabbi Levy. And Rabbi Levy took them to court. And the thing was shown easily to be a forgery because the Hebrew words that were written on said, Kesher le Pesach, which means kosher for Passover. Had nothing to do with the content of the letter, but copied off a cereal packet, of a matzah packet. There was a historian from Rhodes University in Grahamstown who's testified that what they were claiming about things like the Talmud was not actually true. And he defended the Jewish people. And that someone turned around to him and said, why would you, a Gentile, defend the Jew? And he said, because my Messiah was one. I'd recommend that book, The Lie That Wouldn't Die by Hadassah Ben Ito. The anti-Semitism is latent, but under certain circumstances, it will come out to the fore. And it says here, when Haman saw that Mordecai neither bowed down, he was filled with rage, and he wanted to destroy all the Jews who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. In the first month, verse 7, which is in the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, that is the lot. So they called the lot that they were pulling out the pur. It was cast before Haman from day to day and from month to month until the 12th month, that is the month of Adar. And then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, there's a certain people scattered and dispersed amongst the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different to those of all other people, and they do not observe the king's laws, so it is not in the king's interest to let them remain. Very interesting, because that's very much what anti-Semitism is about. They're not part of us. They don't fit with us. They're distinct and they're separate. Yes, they are, because God made them to be. He gave them the laws, which made their lifestyle different to all other nations. And when Gentiles see that, they're filled with jealousy and hatred towards the Jew. Why? It's spiritual. Because the Gentile doesn't want Israel to be elect. I remember witnessing to one Zulu guy one day, and he turned around to me and he said, "Why did God pick the Jew? Why didn't he pick the Zulu?" Why? Because we're so full of pride and we idolize our own earthly identity. That is true whether you're a nationalist or whether you are in the Western world homosexual and you idolize your gay identity. Then you've got an idolatry. And Christ calls us to die to our old life and become a new creation. But when you've got your own human identity as your idol, you will not just ignore what people have to say concerning the election of Israel or that homosexuality is wrong, but you will seek to go on your campaign against them, to take them out, to take away their influence out of society. That's exactly what happened throughout history, especially in the West, when we saw that Jews in the Rome, the period of the Catholic rule in Europe, on earth. The Catholic Church said that Jews were not allowed to have certain occupations. They were not allowed to be part of the guilds. They were forced into becoming money changers. And they did that because they, according to the law, can charge interest to Gentiles. They just can't do it to their fellow Jews. And so they were disdained and despised by Christians because somebody who's good would never charge usury. But it's the only way they could make money. They're different. I think it was Jean-Paul Sartre who said the problem with the Jew is that he is a Jew. If he was a Frenchman, no one would hate him. And he believed anti-Semitism made the Jew Jewish. If it wasn't for anti-Semitism, he would just be French. He would just be one of us. It's the issue of the difference of the Jew that becomes the issue that sparks off anti-Semitism. They're different. Their laws are different to all those other people. The Jews in South Africa, in this book, they were called cosmopolitan. Cosmopolitan, meaning global citizen. Why? Because they had more loyalty to their Jewish brethren from other countries than they had to South Africa. And therefore they were despised because they didn't put the national interests of South Africa first. They're cosmopolitans. They've got a global agenda. They're globalists. That's what the Jews were called. They're different. And so it says in verse 9, "If it is pleasing to the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who carry on the king's business to put in the king's treasuries." He's willing to spend a vast amount of money for the destruction of the Jewish people. The same thing happened in the Holocaust. How much did it cost them to cart these Jews from all over the Reich to get them to the concentration camps? Poland, mass evacuations of Jewish people, and the Polish were celebrating it. We're getting rid of the Jew. All the cost and for what? To vilify, to treat them as the enemy, to treat them as the pariah that needed to be expunged out of the Reich so that their evil influence would not contaminate society. Verse 11 says, the king said to Haman, let's go from verse 10. Then the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. And this is how he's called, the enemy of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, the silver is yours, and the people also, to do with them as you please. In other words, you've given the money, but you use the money. Now let's go to chapter 4, verses 15 to verse 17. Mordecai hears about this. He's distraught. The destruction of the Jewish people is at hand. And he basically tells Esther, you need to go in to see the king. Perhaps you've been brought to royalty for such a time as this. Not so that you do something great for God, but that you rescue the Jewish people from annihilation. That's the way to be born for such a time as this. This is the time to be courageous. This is the time to stand and be willing to lay your life down for the salvation of God's people. That's what it's about. It's not about you doing something great and achieving grandeur and fame. It's about laying your life that others may live. And then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go assemble all the Jews who were found in Susa, and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. And I, my maidens, will also fast in the same way. And thus I will go into the king, which is not according to the law. And if I perish, I perish. Why 3 days and 3 nights? Because often that's a picture of death and resurrection. Abraham went for a 3 days journey with his son Isaac to offer him up on the mountain. And the book of Hebrews says he received him back as a picture of the resurrection. Because he thought he would get his son back by resurrection, because God had promised that was the son of promise, and yet the same God had told him to kill him. The only way God's going to be able to fulfill the purpose through Isaac that he's promised, if I kill him, is that God's going to raise him from the dead. So he believed in the resurrection, and he received him back as a type. 3 days, 3 nights, death, burial, and resurrection. In other words, it's teaching us that right from the beginning, in his heart, he had already given Isaac up. And here, why is it 3 days and 3 nights? Because Esther turns around and says, she's decided, if I perish, I perish. Her life has been laid down from this moment. This is Esther fast in South Africa. Are people laying their lives down and saying, Lord, if this is the end of my life now, then it's the end of my life. Why are they going for 3 days and 3 nights? Because they think they've got a formula here to turn South Africa around. I hope South Africa does get turned around, but it won't be because of this Esther fast. Maybe God will hear the cries and prayers of people's hearts, but not because they fasted 3 days and 3 nights. Not because of this text. There's a misuse of this text. And so Esther goes in to see the king. She organized 2 feasts. She asked the king to bring Haman with him. Haman, when he sees Mordecai, he's so elated that he's the queen's special privileged guest. Nobody else has been invited. But seeing Mordecai doesn't satisfy him. That pride doesn't satisfy him as long as he sees Mordecai the Jew. That special privilege he had with Queen Esther didn't satisfy him as long as he sees Mordecai the Jew. And his wife says, why don't you build a gallows and ask the king to hang Mordecai? Now Mordecai had previously saved the king's life by telling Esther of a plot to kill the king. And Esther told the king in Mordecai's name, and Mordecai's name was written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Persia. And so one night before Esther's second feast, the king Ahasuerus, Xerxes, can't sleep. They read to him from the book of the Chronicles. They read about Mordecai. The king says, did we do anything to thank Mordecai? They said, not yet, sir. And he's wondering what to do to reward Mordecai when that morning Haman comes in to ask for the king to kill Mordecai on the gallows he's made. And the king turns around to Haman and says, what shall be done for the king for the man whom the king wishes to honor? And Haman thinks, well, who could the king wish to honor except me? You know, he's the most important person in the universe. And so Haman his thoughts run away with him. You know, get your royal chariot, get him to ride, get your trusted servant to go before him and call out, thus it happens to the man whom the king wishes to honor. The king says, that's a fantastic idea. You do that for Mordecai. You take Mordecai through the streets and you shout out before Mordecai, dress him in the royal robe, let him wear my ring, and you shout out before the people, thus it happens to the man whom the king wishes to honor. Haman does it. He knows not to cross the wrath of the king, but he is angry. He goes back home and tells them what happened, and they turn around and they say, Mordecai's a Jew. Well, you're not going to succeed now. No one can destroy the Jews and it go well with them. While they're talking, people come to fetch Haman for Esther's second feast. And when he turns up there, this is what happens. Esther chapter 7. Now the king and Haman came to drink with Esther the queen. And the king said to Esther on the second day, also as they drank their wine at the banquet, "What is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you, and what is your request? Even to half of the kingdom it shall be done." Then Queen Esther replied, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me as my petition, and my people as my request." In other words, I'm not asking for anything except the right to live. "For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Now, if we had only been sold as slaves, men and women, I would have remained silent, for the trouble would not be commensurate with the annoyance to the king." This is another reason why the Esther fast in South Africa is not applying this correctly, because she wouldn't have asked the people to fast if it was just an issue of corruption. If it was just an issue of even being sold into slavery, she wouldn't have gone. Applying the Esther fast to what is happening in South Africa, as serious as what is happening in South Africa is, trivializes this very issue of the annihilation of the Jewish people. You cannot equate the terrible corruption that's happening in this country, how it's destroying this country, to what had been decided against the Jewish people here. Yes, this is very bad. This is absolutely much more diabolical, because you're going against God's chosen people and not just enslaving them and not just doing corruption against them, but full on genocide of every single Jewish person, man, woman, and child. Even what is happening to the farmers in South Africa does not compare, and that's bad. Does not compare to this. We're trivializing what Haman was trying to do. The king, verse 5, then King Ahasuerus asked Queen Esther, "Who is he and where is he who would presume to do this?" Esther said, "A foe and an enemy is this wicked Haman." Then Haman became terrified before the king and queen. And the king arose in his anger from drinking wine and went into the palace garden. But Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that harm had been determined against him by the king. He knew the king well and he could read the king. And it says, "Now when the king returned from the palace garden into the place where they were drinking wine, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. And then the king said, 'Will he even assault the queen with me in the house?'" Now it's quite farcical because he's begging for his life, but when the king walks in, it looks like he's jumping on Esther and assaulting her. As the word went out from the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. It depersonalizes Haman. Haman is depersonalized. He's lost his humanity because of what he tried to do to the Jewish people. And look what it says. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs who was before the king, said, "Behold, indeed, the gallows standing at Haman's house, 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on behalf of the king." And the king said, "Hang him on it." Now we go from there, and the king writes another law into place. He can't undo what he's done before because it's according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked. So he puts another law in place, and it's the law that the Jews can stand up and fight and defend themselves when the people come to attack them. And that goes on for 2 days, not just the one day, the 2 days. The fear of the Jews fell on people. People started wanting to be identified with Jewish people. I want to be a Jew as well. It became fashionable. And the Jews destroyed the anti-Semites from the kingdom. 75,000 people. 75,000 anti-Semites were killed. Why do we talk about this? Because what happened to the Jew at that time did not belong to that time alone. Netanyahu was right to give a scroll of Esther to President Barack Obama. Netanyahu was right to do that. We have to learn this lesson. And what are the lessons we learn from this? Firstly, anti-Semitism has to be rooted out and destroyed, especially amongst those who confess the name of Jesus. It was anti-Semitism plus replacement theology that gave rise to the Holocaust. Out of these 3 books that I've talked about today, well, it's actually 4, this is the one I would recommend the most. You can't get it in print anymore, but if you go into Amazon, you can pay for it in Kindle. It's called They Conspire Against Your People by Colin Barnes. And it talks about the role that the European churches played at the time of the Holocaust. And I always thought, well, that's Catholicism, and Catholicism is a false form of Christianity. And I still hold to that. But when you read this book, it's not just Catholicism. I'm just going to read here from this book, page 110. Let's actually go from page 109. Turning to the smaller churches, the Evangelical Alliance, a grouping of the smaller, theologically conservative churches, also supported the boycott against Jewish people. Their official paper, the Alliansblatt, supported measures to restrict and even eliminate Jewish influence, at least in the economic and cultural fields. That's the Evangelical Alliance in Germany. It spoke of the Jewish threat and even felt required to encourage the state in its anti-Semitic policies. The state should not shrink back from measures relating to national policy which it believed were necessary. A healthy cultural policy must roll back the pernicious influence of Jewish Bolshevism. In other words, they're saying the Jews are the global influence. They're the globalists taking over the world behind the communist agenda. That rhetoric is still alive today amongst QAnon supporters who followed Trump, who supported Trump. Not all Trump supporters, but a sizable minority of these Trump supporters were believing that there's 300 Jewish families behind this thing called Tavistock and this New World Order that are trying to take over the world. One of the families listed were the Rockefellers, who are not even Jewish. The Jews were being portrayed in these documentaries that have been on YouTube in recent years as being the influence that brought in homosexuality into the United States and into the entertainment industry. It's the Jews that are pushing mixed marriages between whites and blacks. You can kind of see where they're coming from. It's pretty a white nationalistic agenda. But the Jews are the scapegoats. The Jews are the ones who are seen to be behind it. And they will see Zionism as part and parcel of this. Zionism for them is not the Jews having their own homeland in the land of Israel, the land of their forebears. No, it's this Jewish agenda to take over the world. That is the rhetoric that was here. These people, like these QAnon supporters, are saying the Jews are contaminating society. That's what they said then. And it says here, Der Taufebote, the Austrian Baptist paper, applauded the German government in 1933, that is long before Anschluss, for raising a mighty dam against the Jewish flood. The Baptists. Why? Because look at what the Jews are doing in the society. They're the evil, corrupting influence in our Christian society. I was in a church in New Zealand, and this person who was very much a Trump supporter and believed Trump was holding back the communist threat, the New World Order, came up to me and he said, maybe we got it wrong about Hitler. Maybe he isn't the demon that in history we've made him out to be. Maybe the history has been revised. Why? Because Hitler was holding back the communists from invading Europe. The Catholic Church were behind Hitler because of that fact. You've got people who follow this kind of thinking. They say the Holocaust never happened. It wasn't as bad as they made it out. It wasn't 6 million Jews. It says, likewise, the brethren, Die Tenor, spoke of the accursed nature of the Jews and of the cleansing of Germany from Jewish immigrants. On June the 18th, 1933, Licht und Leben carried an article by the chairman of the Genau Association to promote fellowship and evangelization, Walter Michaelis, stating that he and his organization had nothing against stemming Jewish influence and treating Jews as non-Germans. From a biblical point of view, nothing could be said against this, and it was indeed part of the divine plan for them, because they're just accursed people. Look at Deuteronomy. They're just accursed people, and that's their lot, and so we should support what is happening against the Jewish people. Railton finds that Gnadau Association talked about the Aryan laws in the same way as the authors of a report on the subject produced by the Marburg Theological Faculty on 19th of September 1933. The Church of the Reformation could not accept or implement laws excluding Jews from their fellowship, even though in their view the government certainly had a right to impose such laws on society as a whole. At the Baptist World Alliance Conference in Berlin in 1934, a German Baptist leader stated that while all races are equal before God, a government has to protect itself from a race that is destructive by nature. Concerning the Nuremberg laws, the Baptist Wahrheitssieger told its readers not to forget that the hearts of Jews had been hardened by God following their rejection of the Messiah. Under God's judgment, they had become a curse for the world. Likewise, the founder of the Elim Pentecostal Church in Germany stated that he had warmly welcomed the Nuremberg laws and knew that they did not violate God's word in any way. Heilig dem Herrn welcomed the new laws, while the Allianzblatt said that every Christian in Germany would be able to give hearty assent to the new laws, for they were the only correct solution for the Jewish question. What is this Jewish question? So what do we do about this Jew? They don't fit in anywhere. They corrupt society. They're evil. What do we do with them? Many people across Europe and in Russia were asking the same question. All Hitler did is he came around and said, I have the answer, the final solution. We annihilate them, just like Haman tried to do. Just like Haman tried to do. There have been huge misrepresentations of the Talmud. One of the misrepresentations of the Talmud is, and this was taught in medieval Europe, that the Jews are sanctioned by the Talmud to kidnap Christian children or Christians to sacrifice them for their blood. That is not Talmudic Judaism. The editor of Christliche Welt, Professor Martin Rader, wrote that the Nuremberg laws could form the basis for a positive solution to the Jewish question. In a similar vein, the director of the Berlin City Mission, Pastor Hans Dannenbaum, stated, I can only declare in public that the City Mission, mindful of its founder, Adolf Stöcker, still considers the removal of every influence of the Jewish spirit from the life of the German folk to be one of the most important tasks of state leadership, and this is supported by us in the spirit of Christianity. All of these were evangelical Protestant. When you look at the Holocaust, you need to read this book. When you look at the Holocaust, we cannot turn around and say, that's Catholicism for you. It was the evangelicals as well. And why was it the evangelicals? Because everybody had swallowed this lie that God has finished with the Jewish nation and the church is the new Israel. And therefore, as long as the Jews are outside of the church, we're to hate them. We're to eradicate their influence. We're not only to accept that by breaking the law, they put themselves under the curse of the law, but we're also to support the curses. This started in the medieval era. You read the book, you see the history. And these ideas have not gone anywhere. If we learn anything from the book of Esther, it is that unless the anti-Semitism and the replacement theology is rooted out the kernel, this Holocaust can happen one day again. Certainly could happen one day again. And if you read Zechariah 13, it seems inevitable. God will turn the curses that happened to Israel. He'll turn it on those enemies that came against Israel and supported the people that supported it. Like in Obadiah. What does it say in Obadiah? Obadiah verse 15. For the day of the Lord draws near on all the nations. As you have done, it will be done to you. Your dealings will return on your own head, because just as you drank on my holy mountain, all the nations will drink continually. They will drink and swallow and become as if they had never existed. Esther teaches us that God is very angry with anti-Semitism and attitudes towards the Jewish people that linger, that are under the surface, under the conditions that Europe found themselves in, needing a scapegoat. Germany needed a scapegoat after the First World War. And the conditions that related to Haman, seeing Mordecai not bowing down to him, finding out he's a Jew. It brings that anti-Semitism to the fore. Same thing happened in South Africa. The economic crisis, the problems that were happening on the mines, and the Jews were treated as the scapegoat. They're the ones behind these strikes that were happening by these white mining workers because they weren't getting paid enough. It's the communist Jews who are behind it, the Bolsheviks. Look at these pictures of how Jewish people have been portrayed in society. You don't deal with anti-Semitism, you're gonna end up with another Haman, another Hitler. And those people who support it, they are complicit in what someone like a Hitler does. It takes courage to stand against the tide of anti-Semitism. It took courage for Esther to stand before the king, because it could have cost her her life. It took courage for someone like Corrie ten Boom. And why does God do that for the Jewish people? Why does he call people to do that? Not because the Jews are anything special in and of themselves. It's not because the Jews are any better than anybody else. And it's despite the fact that you might encounter Jews who are the most corrupt people you might have met. Simply because God is faithful to his promises to Abraham. It's because of God, not because of them. Like the professor from Rhodes University in Grahamstown, on trial, defending the Jew. Why do you, a Gentile Christian, defend this Jew? He said, because my Messiah was a Jew.